we will now transition to the first panel, and I have the opportunity to play the host to an amazing set of panelists who are with us right now. So I'm going to let our administrative team pin everyone. Just let's give them a few seconds as we get started. All right. So we have an amazing panel coming up, and this panel we are going to talk a little bit about unlocking the economic, social, and environmental opportunity for India. And before even I start, I must thank Morag for joining late in the evening in Australia. Thank you, Morag, for taking this time to be with us. So firstly, I would like to introduce Morag. So Morag is permaculture and regenerative agriculture food system specialist, lives in a Australian eco village. Would love to know a little bit more about it as we get along, Morag. Next, we have Samir. Samir lives in Washington, D.C., but right now he's in India, so fortunate for us. So Samir works with the NRDC, or the Natural Resources Defense Council, works on policy, on clean energy, energy access, climate resilience, etc. Last but not the least, we have Pratna. Pratna, thank you so much. She heads the India team at CDP, works on disclosure and science-based target setting for companies, works with tens and probably 100 companies in India. So we'll get to talk a little bit about them in a bit. So to kick things off, I just wanted to pose a question first to Samir. Samir, when we spoke, you mentioned that you are in India because you're visiting some of the rural villages in Ahmedabad or in Gujarat, where you're exploring what's going on with the Seva women. So that caught my attention, Samir. And so when you talk about circularity, and obviously you work at a policy level, but at the same time, when you come and visit these communities, villages, the work that is going on, my question to you is, like we spoke, I think Wilma also remarked in the earlier keynote, how much of this circularity is going back to what we already knew, right? So, are we really going back to how we used to live 50, 70, 100 years ago before plastics were invented? Or are you seeing new innovative approaches to community change as far as circularity and waste is concerned when you visit these communities, in Gujarat right now? So please give us some insight into that.
Sure. Thanks, Vishnu. And hi, everyone. A pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on the panel as well. So as you rightly said, there is profound learning in the villages in which, you go a few 100 kilometers, sometimes not even that, from a major metropolitan center, and you actually go back a few 100 years in time, and then you can see what is it that we've learned and what is it that we've forgotten, equally importantly. I was reminded of this hilarious article, which was doing the rounds last year, about Amazon sells cow dung cakes online, and somebody had posted a review saying, this is a ridiculous taste, it tastes horrible, it's grassy and muddy and can improve in crunchiness and stuff. But the fact is, just think, a few 100 years ago, our foreparents who thought, let's use this, excreta of an animal that we own for a practical purpose. How radical was that thought, way back then? And it is still, if you go to Western countries, they'll look like, what? But it's happening. So the ethos of, resource efficiency, using everything, wasting less, has been with us for a very, very long time. Now that, we have a problem of plenty, people have so many options, we sometimes forget that, but it has been there. We just need to, like I said, go a few 100 kilometers, and then we'll see, how people are still so mindful of what they consume, how they consume, and how they can make the most of it. So the phrase circular economy might be new, but it has been a part of life for a long time. So to answer your question, I think there is a lot that we can learn from the way we were living, but at the same time, we need to embrace change. Technology has also helped the world move forward in many ways. And so it's a little bit of both, to see where we are going, we need to remember where we've come from and then make the best use of that.
And where were you, Samir, in Gujarat? Which village, and where were you spending your time?
Yeah, so we were in two villages. One village, Phagani, in Anand district of Gujarat, and then another Naganomat in Arvalli district in Gujarat. And NRDC, Seva, and MNRE are implementing green village plans there. So just looking at folks who haven't had access to modern energy, clean energy for a long time, how do they move up the socioeconomic prosperous ladder in a sustainable, climate change friendly way. So yeah, it was a very profound experience.
Thank you, Samir. So with that, let's just shift a little bit of gear. Morag, you are the permaculture and regenerative agriculture, expert. And obviously, regeneration and in agriculture especially is also coming back to traditional cultures like India or Africa, or even in I'm sure in the Aboriginal communities. It's been present for a long time, right? So how do you see that? Meaning, how do you bring about that change back? Because it's almost like going back to the same community and saying, I don't have anything new to tell you. Go listen to your grandparents, right? Go listen to your elders, right? So how is that coming up for you? And can you just give us an example of how a community has started embracing that, wherever the community is? And obviously then we can apply it to India. But how are you seeing it change at a community level in where you work?
It's a really great point, and I've come across it just about everywhere I've gone. And permaculture itself and all regenerative practices are deeply grounded in traditional sustainable cultures. And those traditional sustainable cultures are based deeply on the principles of how nature works. So I think what's really coming forward is it's not necessarily going backwards. It's actually going forwards, embracing the ethics and the principles and the practices of being deeply connected to place, deeply connected to local climate and the local cultural context. So how you apply it shifts and changes and brings in the science and the understanding and our deepening awareness of the importance of, the mycelial network, for example. Like this, all of our understanding deepens and is enriched. And our practices can be amplified. And I also think too, what's happening is that because of the global connectivity now, a lot of the local practices are being shared. It's like, oh, well, you're doing this over here. And so a lot of the local practices are starting to be connected and amplified. So it's definitely not about going backwards. It's about moving forward differently. And, I'm just going to talk very briefly about an example here in Australia with the indigenous community. We have a really close connection. And, these are cultures that have been here for 60 years. Some people say 100,000 years. And the practices of bringing that forward, they basically say, oh, well, we were the original permaculturalists. And I kind of find that really encouraging, thinking that, well, this term permaculture relates deeply to that, but they see it as a way that can help to bring their practices not to be seen as something backward and primitive, but actually something that's at the forefront of where science is now, the forefront of where our thinking needs to go, because regenerative agriculture is kind of the pointy edge of systems thinking in terms of creating the basis for a thriving soil that can draw down carbon, that can create and regenerate our living environment and create a way forward for us.
Where's this community in Australia, Murad?
Well, this one particular community that I have in mind is in, it's a place called Junbun. The community in far north Queensland, up in the rainforest area. And they've been given a piece of land. They were able to get it back into their own common ownership and have decided to start transforming it from a degraded what was sugarcane land, banana land, back into bush foods, regenerative agriculture, and starting to bring back the kind of foods that were there before. And then to share that back out with the world and look at how that can help to feed people in Australia. There were thousands of kilometers of yams, which were a particular type of local potato, that got completely demolished as soon as sheep arrived in the country. And there were fish systems that were integrated into the river. So a focus on regenerating our rivers as the center point of life. I think we need to start putting life at the center of our decision making and life at the center of our design. And that's essentially what permaculture is about. And if we say put our river at the center of our design, like if we're thinking about how do we design a city from the perspective of the river, is it going to nourish and bring it back to life, or is it going to continue to degrade it? Is the way that we develop a new industry going to regenerate the river or degrade it? Is the way that we're doing farming regenerating or degrading? So I think once we take life and perhaps a bioregional perspective, we can start to flip and shift our perspective. And I really like to think about this shift in perspective. You talk about mindset, and I wonder whether we could shift that into a conversation around perspective, because I wonder if we get stuck and we're like set in a way of thinking, a mindset, maybe we get stuck there. We need to kind of keep opening up the different perspectives. And I think shifting it to a perspective of life being at the center of everything can create that. And also shifting our language into more nature-based language too, and that circularity. So I think if we can shift too from thinking about development in a circular way as opposed to a ladder, for example, how can we be thinking about bringing us into that donut economics that Wilma talked about before, that we're not exceeding the boundaries of our planetary conditions, but also not falling into the hole in the middle, and be in this beautiful sweet spot, which is nourishing for people and the planet, for all life.
So before I move, I must tell you, I love your background, and I love the science which you have behind. We should talk about that next time. Next question. So Pratna, when Morag was talking about potatoes, right? So we all know that the amount of potato varieties which existed in the world before McDonald's and after McDonald's, right? So, so companies play a very important role in how things shape up, how circularity shapes up, how do we affect ecosystems? And you are really at the center focus of how do you help companies and at the same time hold them accountable, right? So what is your perspective on this group of people who are really shaping the world, and in terms of production, in terms of meeting the demands of the billions of people around the world? How do you shape their thinking? How do you hold them accountable, or is holding accountable alone enough, right? So what do you actually hold them accountable for? So just give us an example too, Pratna.
Yeah. So thank you very much. I was on the other side for a while, so it gives me really great pleasure that being invited back into this forum, because I'm not really an advocate of the corporate sector. And particularly, I think being in CDP helps me realize that the power of data. And so whatever I'm going to say is based on data that we generate from almost 14,000 companies world over, and in India, almost 100 companies. So, so our objective is basically to drive climate action, look at water security, and drive the conservation of forests. So what we want companies to do is tell us what they are doing in terms of ensuring, how they are mitigating climate risks, looking at forest conservation, and also at water security. So in many ways, there is an element of circularity imbibed in it, but I wouldn't say that we have a direct indicator for circularity, but there are a lot of trends that have emerged over the years from the corporate data that we've generated, which show that there is an inclination to contribute to this concept. And when I say that, if you look at if we look at some of the questionnaires that we've assessed over the last couple of years vis-a-vis some of the recent ones, we see that there is a very, very direct shift from just talking about energy efficiency, energy transition, and renewable energy to things like where the material is being sourced and where the waste is going, including the distribution and the recycling processes. So I think if you look at the larger picture, there is a shift from just looking at energy efficiency, and it's going into the supply chain. Now, the biggest challenge is that it's not just one company we are talking about. We also look at data from the supply chain, and that is where the sourcing of material comes in. And one of the positive trends is that a lot of companies are engaging in disclosing through their supply chain. So even in India, like we're very happy to say that the companies which want to also disclose within the supply chain is increasing. Overall, in the last year, between the last year and this year, 20 and 2021, we had almost a 45% increase in the disclosure in supply chain. And why is this important? This is because this is the upstream. This is where the material is being sourced from. So there are discussions on how you have sustainable sourcing, and also in terms of what is the innovation and the technology transition that can happen in this particular upstream, which could feed back into the product development, which is ultimately about reducing waste and sustainable sourcing. The second very visible feature is the fact that there is a consumer engagement. And this is where we have the production and distribution. So we have companies who are talking about packaging and recycling. So there are very interesting examples. For instance, I want to give the example of a mosquito repellent company, for instance. So when you talk about a mosquito repellent company, it's a small product which goes out to the market. And this is like an 11 crore annual budget market that we're talking about in terms of the households that it goes to. So what this company is doing is they want to measure the scope 3 emissions, which means the energy usage within that, of that small product that goes into households. And also and they're looking at a recycling process so that then they can collect back that material. So there are very, very interesting instances like this, but I must say the challenge is that it is still in an instance mode. So you have, specific companies talking about how they're recycling products. It hasn't transitioned to the whole level of a methodology or a trend. So I think it's time to discuss within the corporate sector and also maybe within our internal discussions that do we really need an indicator for circularity? Because we do have sustainable sourcing, we have packaging, we have production processes, and we have the waste management. So how does one actually look at the entire process, and how do we actually evaluate companies? I think that is the gap that probably thought leaders need to get into, and that is an opportunity actually, because that gives a holistic picture on where a company is.
So just a question, Pradna, and maybe a basic question. So when you assess and kind of, companies get assessed on particular metrics of what you put out, who sees it? Does it get published online, or is it only for the company to take a look at it and then they go and revise the processes, or what happens with the assessment? So
our data is public and is made available on request, and I know we have some partnership agreements in terms of crediting CDP, but the data is available to the companies. I mean, as it is. I mean, what they report, they get back. They get a grade every year in terms of where they are. We have an A, B, C, D kind of a listing, which is done externally. The assessment is done externally, so it's very unbiased. And a lot of our data is actually also used by think tanks. So we do make it available to policymakers and think tanks in terms of gauging. So if somebody wants to understand emissions, or even the whole process of which are the best companies which have good waste management practices, then we can make available that data. And similarly, the data is reviewed every year. So because you have a grading system and you're working with corporates, it's automatically looked at, right? Where did we go wrong? Yeah. So I think they want to achieve the A if they've got a B, so they come back to us for guidance on that.
So Morag, two questions. First is, what is the science behind you? We really want to know. I want to know at least. and secondly, Morag, I think the example, what you pointed to about this community and what is going on there is so inspiring. Now, how do we first learn from it and either replicate it or kind of, what are the next steps? How do we now make this systemic? How do we make this pattern changing, right? How do we take this and go to the next level? How do we inspire many other communities to do so? So I'm sure that's a challenge that you are thinking about and probably giving you some sleepless nights. So yeah, some insights on that would be great.
So, well, thank you, Vishnu, for asking me about my sign. This is actually some of the subjects of within the courses that I run. So we always focus on the soil to begin with, and then exploring, how to create local food, growing abundantly, creating food forests, and focusing on how to create really nutritional dense food and medicinal food, and even thinking about, like, it goes down here, it's like the beauty garden, the tea garden, and cooking up a feast. So it's from the plate, from the soil to the plate, and the whole thing back again. Like, how does that come through? And even we've been talking about textiles. Like, so how do I encourage consumers to think about what's going on in their household, and that any products that they use in their house, whatever water goes down their drain ends up in their garden, for example. So in our eco village, all of our water goes back into our garden. So what products do you use? So there's a circularity there. What clothes do I wear? What happens at the end of its life? So even after I've traded it and shared it and gone around, does it end up in the soil? Can it be composted? So, we ask those sorts of questions. So it's a really sort of consumer front facing movement of change, and looking at, well, what do I put in my hair? What do I put in my face? What is my life practice? So permaculture is essentially about thinking of how can we live a one planet way of life? How can our livelihoods be influenced by that? How can we take those decisions that relate to us personally and in our families and our communities into our businesses and into our organizations as well? And I don't necessarily see that the distinction between that, because we are humans, and as humans we take those thought processes wherever we go, and we start to open up conversations and possibilities. And so that really relates to what your question is about how we scale this up. And I think part of what it is a lot about sharing the stories of it, and not trying to scale up, but trying to work always in wholes. There is a whole system approach. There is a community that exists there that has kind of a boundary. If you think about it from a systems view, that it is a cell, it's a living organism, and that we don't want to sort of try and scale that up until it pops. It is a whole in itself, and describing that whole and sharing how that whole works can inspire other wholes. And what I see happening is the change is not linear. That there is a different kind. I used to think that we had to kind of do this sort of change. We had to work up the ladder and up the pyramid to the pointy end of the decision makers. And I've, since working a lot in the garden, having nature as my teacher, I've flipped over again, like I'm talking about this flip again, that the power lies within this mycelial network. And I think about how change happens in nature, and where the health and the well-being and the integrity of the system lies is in the living soil. And so what I'm noticing is that as we start to connect the threads between these living systems, these systems that are working, so that indigenous community there that's functioning, the refugee community in Africa that's working, to a school program that's working here, to an enterprise, a social enterprise that's working somewhere else. When we start to connect the dots and enable each to see each other, it's kind of like, if you think about how the mycelial network is, it's this great big connected, it's like the internet of the underground in a way. And then every now and then up pop these mushrooms, the flowering of that mycelial net, and we see them, they become visible. And what happens is if we keep throwing compost onto this mycelial network, we feed it, we nourish it, we tend to it in all of those holes, that mushroom will then spore, and 1,000, 1 billion spores will come out of that and land around it. And so it's not this incremental change, it's these bursts, these quantum leaps of change that happen. So a lot of what I've been noticing is that when we tell the stories as a whole, that in a way are able to kind of see between the numbers and add richness and context to what we measure, able to bring the humanity into it and the upliftment of the story that goes with that, or the cultural emergence that is seen there. It inspires change. And in a way of saying we must change, is like an inviting to come into that process of being the change that we want to see in the world. You know, like that's a cliche statement, but when we really inhabit it, we understand what it means, and that is exactly what we need to be doing. So there is an example too that I really wanted to share just quickly with you. It's a different type of example, and it's called Food Connect, and it's a group that I'm involved in here in Brisbane. It connects hundreds of farmers in a bioregion. And it basically is the direct connection between the urban consumers and the producers. Now, what happens when there is this whole systems approach, a bioregional approach, is that together they decide, oh, we'll have no plastic in this. All our workers, like connecting in with a lot of what Wilma was talking about, the workers, everyone is on an even footing, that the distribution networks are strengthened locally. And what they've noticed, that this is a far more resilient way of working. So it's a social enterprise. When we had floods, when the pandemic came through, when there was the fires, this food, while there was no food on the shelves in the supermarkets, these food systems were still connecting and delivering food. And if there's surplus, that food goes to, in their shed, they have a whole lot of different other enterprises, one that collects the food waste and transforms it into something and then sends it out to people in the sort of the food distribution network, to people who can't afford it. So even in India, here in Australia, there's something like 40% that's food waste. It's extraordinary, the amount of food waste that we have, and we don't want to just turn it back into the soil. We can make it into something else. And I would actually hazard to say that because of our monoculture systems, we're actually ending up with far more waste than that even. I would think maybe 70%, because we don't actually, like, we don't eat the pumpkin leaves, we don't eat the sweet potato leaves. That all just gets kind of knocked off. So when we relocalize our food and we start to eat that kind of thing again, we don't need as much space to feed people. We actually just need to regenerate the soils, to diversify our foods that we eat, to think differently about how we're feeding ourselves again. And that's coming back, I guess, to that kind of more traditional way, the rediversification, the bringing food back closer to home, strengthening links between producer and consumer. And these things are really simple strategies, but when we scale them in terms of this mycelial network and the holes, then we can start to see how this is going to work.
I love the internet of the underground. That's going to stay with me. Thank you, Morag, for that. So Samir, obviously your work involves policy a lot. You work with policy, kind of coming up with how the country's policy should look like, etc. So here you are visiting the small village in the Anand district, learning from what's going on there. So I'm actually keen to understand what goes on in your thinking. Like, how do you take what's working in Anand, in that little village there? How does it inform policy, number one? Because, policy, of course, is national, it's pretty large. And I just want to kind of extend that a little bit, if you may allow me, to what Wilma was talking about as the GDP, right? So meaning the way we look at GDP needs to be different, right? From a country perspective. So how do we stretch this, best practices, knowledge, whatever you're doing from the community level at the village level? How do we stretch it? What all you have to go through to make it really big, at a national level? Because, that's really big impact as far as systemic change is concerned.
So let me start from where Morag mentioned, strengthening the linkage between consumer and producers. I think that is applicable at so many levels, because we've just taken it for granted that we find stuff on the shelves and that's how it is produced. We rarely ever think how much it has traveled and traversed to get there, and where will it go from after we've interacted with it. So I think I'm more familiar with the world of renewable energy. So if that's the example I'll refer to, but it's the same ethos of producers. For example, solar panels, batteries are more common in my world. And while no doubt, undoubtedly, renewable energy is taking us forward in combating climate change, and is the preferred choice of energy that we have going forward. At the same time, this is a time to pause and reflect. What is it that we will be dealing with 25 years later, 30 years later, when there's end of life for the batteries that we are installing, the solar panels that we are using. There are estimates that just by 2030, just in India, we'll have 200,000 tons of solar panels at their end of life. And by 2050, it is expected to be 2 million tons. Wow. It's like Herculean waste that we are thinking of. It's even difficult to visualize. And currently, there is very little that we have invested in to the technology to recover. It kind of goes back to what Wilma was saying earlier, the cost of recovery versus the value of recovered goods, and then who pays for the difference. Again, the consumers and the producers, there's a responsibility, first of all, if you have to look at it systematically, to costing it right. What we are thinking of is just the monetary value of the solar panels or the battery, for example. The lithium that you can recover from a lithium ion battery is worth pittance. It's nothing because the lithium is so abundant. But it isn't just about the economic value of the minerals that you are recovering. It is about what if you don't do that? And then what happens? What happens when these toxics, a lot of these elements are in the ecosystem? What is happening with microplastics all over the world? And once you start costing all of those, then that naturally answers, where is it that we need to find the appropriate actors to bear that cost? And in some cases, it may not be just producers or consumers, because you can believe in the essential goodness of humanity, but a little nudge and encouragement now and then doesn't hurt at all. So there are also regulations, and unfortunately, we are like woefully behind on what we need to have recognized the value of circularity at a global scale. Forget about state or at a village level, perhaps, yes. Well, that's where we've ended. And our supply chains are just so integrated these days that we cannot just expect California or Germany to have done something and that's enough. It's not, because many cases stringent regulations from places that can afford to have them will just end up diverting the waste to poorer countries. And we've seen that happen and that play so many times in the past. So there is a need for a global consensus, a global understanding, a regulation of how do we look at end of life, how do we look at circularity, recycling, and then figuring out what's the best, most economic, most climate and health friendly way of dealing with those. And there are policies. For example, one of the things we've discovered in batteries is that a lot of times batteries are not touched by recyclables just because they're classified as hazardous waste. So, so policies that need to step back and look at, what is the other implication of not doing anything about them. So defining what is hazardous, what is not, and how do we build incentives? How do we invest into research and demonstrate that this can be economically recovered at scale? Those policies are equally important, and this is the time as we are moving to an electronics-based, waste generating economy. This is the time to pause and reflect on what we are going to do.
Ratna, you had a couple of comments. I would also invite you to speak a little bit about the supply chain point, which Samir was talking about, but you also had a point on food waste.
Yeah, so no, actually, it's quite related, I think, and I actually wanted to just add to what Murag said and what Samir just mentioned, and because just translating from the micro level and the work that they're doing to a corporate level and how complex it becomes. But I just wanted to give an example because she talked about the food waste, and I said that one of the companies that disclosed to us the last 2 years has it's basically a canned juice company, and they have actually talked about their supply chain from the perspective of the fact that how they are trying to actually create a model where the fruit peels are used and pushed back as as manure, used for manure. So I think there are examples like that, but I think the challenge here is the scale. I mean, you have one company taking that initiative. How does one look at scaling these processes or replicating this good practices? Because when it comes to the corporate sector, we also asked them why do they disclose to us, and almost 58% felt that it gives them a competitive edge. Now, will they perceive that as a competitive edge, or will they share that process is a question that we need to ask. So it becomes slightly different when you're working with the business community, because everything makes good economic sense. But at the same time, we had 1 out of 3 companies which said that they disclose because it helps them discover which practices are cost effective. Now, if you look at it, circularity from that perspective, reuse, recycling, then I think then obviously companies would start adapting that practice. So I think it's also it's our job to kind of look at where these inroads are and make the communication correct. And this is where probably the transfer of information and knowledge in terms of what is possible in terms of groups that are doing this kind of work to the corporate sector, and providing these examples with at some point of time play a major role. But coming back to what did you ask me about, Samir? I'm sorry.
No, the supply chain conversation. Yeah, you mentioned supply chain in the opening.
Yeah, so basically, when I said supply chain, I mean, I was just trying to give these examples. I'm saying that, the raw material sourcing, for instance, is part of the supply chain. So we have also, within the disclosure process, instances of, for instance, food processing industries going back to the agricultural sector and transferring knowledge on energy efficiency. Now, that itself is a model and would help in innovation or transfer of technology to a particular sector which may not otherwise have access to. So there are case examples like this, the food processing industry, what I told you just now and earlier about the mosquito repellent, and then we have other sectors. So these are, again, as I said before, these are cases. Now, the challenge is how do we, transform these cases to larger models, larger methodology. And I think that is where what Samir also brought up in terms of regulation and policy. And I feel the other aspect is finance. And, recently we have an example of, 5 European banks tying up and for investing in circularity, putting funds, separate particularly for circularity. And for us at CDP, investors become very important because most of our data is used by investors. So again, that is the drive. So I think at some point of time, the financing part needs to be also discussed, because I think circularity is about costing, and it's about it needs to be made into a good business, and so I think that is something also maybe that can drive not just not just the corporate sector in general, but also help in the supply chain transitioning to towards more circularity.
Thank you. So I just wanted to kind of change gears a little bit to kind of talk a little bit about mindsets. I'm always fascinated with mindsets, because the best example I always can think of is, Wikipedia, right? So, now trying to explain to my 14-year-old son that we all grew up with books called Britannica Encyclopedia in the bookshelves. It's like, who does that? Why would you put an encyclopedia into a book, right? So it's going to keep changing. So why were you doing that, right? So that's the sort of mindset shift that has happened, at least as far as knowledge is concerned, right? And Wikipedia played a major role in making that shift happen, right? So I'm hoping that we will have a similar shift, if not soon, on circularity, right? So somebody in the future, a young kid might say, you used plastics? Were you guys crazy? That would be nice, for us to defend that we were ending up using plastics for so many years. So that sort of mindset shift, how do we cause it? What can we do? What kind of ideas that we can bring about? And obviously, Samir, you work in policy. So policy is obviously one way to enforce mindset shifts, but what other things can we do to kind of cause mindset shifts? And, because we just don't have time, right? Probably we have to do this in the next 10 years. So, in 10 years, how do we cause this huge mindset shift in the minds of everybody? We need a Martin Luther King Jr. or we need Mahatma Gandhi. What do we need? How do we cause this mindset shift? So Samir, we know that you have to leave us in a few minutes, but first, why don't you just go and give us your comments before you have to leave?
It's the hardest thing to do, changing mindsets, and especially of people like us. Once I think we're beyond the age of 10 or 12, we become just so fixed in our mindsets. It's so hard. Well, policy regulation does help. Surprisingly, sometimes there's just a 5 pence charge on plastic bags. We all know, the 5 cent, 5 pence, whatever price it was in India, has led to a drastic reduction in the use of plastic bags. As simple as that. It doesn't really add up, but it worked. I think just the incentives and disincentives at appropriate parts of the life cycle of a product are really, really important. Sometimes as simple as making it convenient, disclosing just the labels on the products, what is it made of and how to dispose of that product in itself, helps people who are still wondering, what do those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 numbers within the triangle on the back of a plastic box mean? So just making information more accessible, making producers factor the cost of recycling, repurposing, reusing the end of life of their product is equally important. So the regulation plays a role there as well. But I think India is kind of touched upon the right nerve at the COP, the climate conference that happened in Glasgow last year. Indian Prime Minister talked about lifestyle for environment. More recently, earlier this month, also, there was a national launch of lifestyle for environment. I think that's a very catchy slogan, and if it catches on, and if you implement it fully, has such a powerful message, because it's also about sustainable consumption, not just about production. How do we engage with the stuff we engage with? And I am a firm believer that education is critical. So embedding, imparting education about living in harmony with nature, making the most of the resources, treading lightly upon this planet at a young age are just so essential. Providing, and just not just awareness or preaching is not enough until we provide skills, the technologies, the resources to actually be able to do so. So that's where I think you provide all those enabling environments, and mindsets slowly but surely will change.
Thank you, Samir. And by the way, thank you for joining us if you have to leave us early. So Morag,
so just thank you very
doing?
much. And
Sure.
yeah, very nice. And I'll watch the video. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Samir. So Morag, when we talk about mindsets, how are you dealing with mindsets? Because you conduct courses, you have people visiting your eco-villages. How much of mindsets you believe have been touched or changed? Or is it work in progress?
Well, it's always a work in progress. That's absolutely right. And I think, many of the things that Samir were talking about, I would also agree with it, making things visible, making the labeling so that it, if you see something labeled, you think, oh, well, I should be asking the question about that. So it puts it in front of you to be asking that question. So I think that's important. I also think that, a number of different shifts in policies and even shift in subsidy. And, this is what I've noticed too. Say, for example, in Britain, there is because of the climate emergency and the ecosystems, the extinction crisis, there has been a shift in the policy of agriculture, and the subsidies have been shifted towards more ecological farming practices. Now, that's going to make quite, like substantial differences where the money goes, what it supports. And so people will start to shift their practices. So that's kind of one, but that's harder to do. That comes after there's a lot of this mycelial change that's going on. So I focus on that side of things. And one thing that we're really working on, and I mentioned it a bit before, it's the story. And it's about connecting in with, say, high profile people who can tell that story. I talk a lot with people who are in filmmaking and starting to talk about, well, what's going on in the background of that film? What is it when they're sitting down to eat? What are they eating? What are they wearing? It's the context that we are, the things that we're watching and noticing, and how does that inform what we think is kind of normal. And I think that's shifted a lot lately. I think that's shifted incredibly. The other thing is about celebration. I think Samir mentioned this a bit too. He's like, you can't tell people to change. We can educate, we can provide opportunities, but we need to really attract people to this. We need to be inviting, celebrate the things that are really working, acknowledge the things that are where we're wanting to be heading, and really focusing on that. So I think that's kind of a huge part of it. Make it delicious. Part of what the work I do is always inviting people to amazing events where they get to taste the change. Like there's something about eating something that's straight from the farm or straight from the garden, and the explanation of the journey of that food and the story of the farmer becomes central to the experience of the food. And I think this really changes people's heart around food, the relationship. So it's kind of the head, it's the mindset, but it's also the heart. When people feel touched by something, a shift happens at a whole body level. And I think that is far more important than often we give credit to. When we feel moved by someone's story or by the impact that something's having. So sparking the imagination, sparking the possibilities. I was reading somewhere saying people don't want a new mindset. They want new opportunities or possibilities. So you can't go and say to someone, I'm going to help you to change your mindset. It's like, I don't want to change my mindset, but if you go forward with the possibilities and opportunities and new things that invite them in, then their mindset or their way of thinking will just change as part of being in that experience. So what I do is always try and create opportunities for a new experience, a new perception, a new way of seeing things, a new way of connecting different things together that not thought of before. I just had a group of year 12 design students who are focusing on circular design. And so I showed them my toilet, for example. I have a compost toilet. It was kind of really weird for them, but they were intrigued. It didn't smell. They learned about how it went out and fed the fruit trees. And, that was interesting. Or they looked at the house and went, okay, this house uses 80% less energy than any other system. It's completely solar powered, collects all its water goes out into the garden, but it looks like a normal house. So this opportunity to demonstrate and to then experience that and go, oh, well, this is something that makes sense to me. I could do this. And it's not that much different, but yet it's very different because it holds behind it a whole different set of context, a different paradigm. It's that life-centered design. And when they feel it and they have that opportunity to come into direct relationship with it, there is something that is experienced in that moment. And so what I try and do is always offer as many different possibilities for having an engagement with it. And the educational experience is the experience of being in relationship with that. And whether that be out in the farm tasting things or in the home garden and experiencing what it is you can just go out and harvest yourself. And that, oh, wow, that's interesting. I was out in the garden digging up all the different sorts of plants, and we were digging up turmerics and harvesting tulsi leaves, and we were gathering all sorts of things and having a feast straight from the garden. And that was surprising to lots of people.
Yeah.
So the experience, I think, is something that's important.
No, I think, I totally hear you. It's experience, and I'm sure you heard this. The way to somebody's heart is through the stomach. And then I think I heard you say that once you touch the heart, then probably the mindset's change. So that really resonates. So Pradhan, I'm going to probably pull in a question from the audience as I invite you to talk a little bit about changing mindsets in companies, because the mindset shift in companies kind of spreads to the employees and eventually to the customers and stakeholders, etc. And so how is changing mindsets in companies, even things like sustainable procurement, and how does that work inside companies? Are they fixed on certain ways, or how hard do you find in changing some of those things? Or at least by highlighting them, this is what is going wrong, do you see that they automatically change as well?
So that's a really difficult question, because my life in the corporate sector has just begun, in the sense that I have traditionally been an environmental educator. So the very fact that I moved to the corporate sector is I want to make some influence in this area. So I think, and it's a very important question for me, because I think ultimately it is about changing mindsets. I mean, whatever you get done, and I think I did mention this. For the corporate sector, something has to make business sense, and I think unless you look at the cost effectiveness of doing something, it's ultimately it's a business, right? So I think the advantage today that we have as a community of environmental educators, policymakers, whatever we want to label ourselves, but the advantage today we have is that the corporate sector is beginning to understand climate risk. They're beginning to understand that there is there is a problem out there, and it's bad business if you're not going to really look at resource efficiency, if you're not going to look at procuring in a way that it's contributing to nature positively, so nature-based solutions, and all these are terminologies that have begun to take begun to become popular even within the corporate sector. So I think it is for us to leverage on this and see how we can create a story, as Murag said, while we are thinking about the stories for the general people, or the younger generation, or maybe, as Murag said, the design community. I think we need a story for the corporate sector too, and I think the communication that we create for the corporate sector is going to be very important, which is why we don't need ESG specialists. We need people who understand what the real environmental issues are. And I was thinking today when we were having, I was just thinking what I should talk about. And I said that, 25, 30 years back, when I entered into the environmental field, I started my career as a conservation educator, and we had something called the web of life, which we played around with. It's a spider web which discusses the food chain, and the moment you let go of one end, it collapses. So I was just thinking we need something like a web of life to talk about circularity, because whether you talk about air pollution or water pollution or resource regeneration, there is a connection. I mean, it has to be talked as an entirety, because we have these boxes today, and even within our questionnaire, I mentioned to you, we have companies reporting on sustainable procurement. They have the efficient business processes, and about distribution of how they collect their waste and how they manage their waste. But again, how do we create the story of circularity? And that can actually change the mindset, because then it gets into strategy, because we need circularity to get into strategy. Now we have the other thing we have seen that's positive in disclosure is that we see that almost over 50% of the companies that report to us, that disclose to us, are talking about climate at the governance level, at the board level, which is a huge opportunity. So I think from a corporate angle, if we can get some stories into that level and make it sound that this is good business, but it's also good for you, the reputation for the planet, because we survive in the planet. So I think the story that we weave can go, if it does reach that level, then it gets into strategy, and then we have the entire, mindset change. Because for us, unless the top level decides to change or decides the company strategy, it will not percolate, among other things, of course.
Morag, I have an earlier question which kind of, asks you, how do you document all of this, right? Meaning, how do you document all the work that you do so that, others can access it and kind of, use it in other communities, number one. And do you also connect whatever practices you do to the market? Like, you talked a little bit about vegetables and, supply and all of that. Do you also connect to the market? So that's a question which came up earlier in the Q&A. So do you want to address that?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. So I document this at the moment through the education programs that I do. So I host podcasts, masterclasses. I have a YouTube channel with lots of stories on it. The classes that I run have lots of case studies within them. So there's this richness of content that keeps evolving and emerging like that. I am considering preparing a book at the moment, but that's on the cards. So through that's where we document it. Definitely there is connection with the market, and one thing in particular, the idea that I was sharing with you about the local food connect project, that is deeply around getting local food systems directly to market, because traditionally, if you're a small farmer, it was very difficult to actually get into anything like the supermarket chains, for example, here in Australia. Whereas this creates, you can't compete with the big players, with the monocultures. So you don't compete, you create a different system. And it is a system that needs to engage with that sort of the relationship building with the urban community, and it's actually building that new structure, the sort of the social enterprise to support that. So it is very much about looking from farm to the table and what everything else goes in between. And it is definitely a whole systems design approach. And similarly, I do a lot of work too with refugee communities. And, obviously there, the key part of this is about creating nutritional food and also creating opportunities for livelihood. So we're focusing on how we can create very fast turnaround but regenerative approaches. So we're doing things like mushroom farming, and then the mushroom compost becomes the food for the garden, and then the garden produce becomes, feed, the surplus from that goes to, say, some chickens, and then the chicken, so there's this circularity of creating products there at a small scale. And so you can scale this up and down depending on the size of your farm. The same principles apply, but really it's about trying to shorten the distance between the producer and the consumer, and making sure that we're not kind of putting animals over here, plants over there. It's bringing that integration back into the system, and also bringing people back into the system. We're not just designing a farm landscape, we're designing, healthy, the things that support healthy human habitats. Right. How do we live well on this planet? How do we cultivate health for people, for the planet, and for all life? And that is kind of the design challenge that permaculture kind of tasks itself to approach. As you opened it, Vishnu, this conversation, like community by community. And, this is where the richness of this lies, and then telling the story between communities. Permaculture is now just about in every country around the world. And the stories that get shared amongst the permaculture community are incredible stories of positive change, of a paradigm shift, and of seeing things different. And I'm seeing the permaculture approach being taken into architecture firms, into engineering firms, into agricultural firms. They may not necessarily call it permaculture, but they've definitely, they express to me, because I sort of talk to people in all different fields, how much learning about permaculture has helped them to remind them about the value of putting life at the center of their decision making, and the embedding the ethics and the principles of life-centered design in what they're doing. And and also to make sure that we do connect the different spheres of our world. So we don't separate into our silos of, okay, well, this is where we farm over here, and this is where we have our cities over here, and this is where we have our technology. It's like, well, how do we pull all of those things together and weave the threads? Obviously, we need to pull out those different sectors at different times and look more closely in how we can readapt. But how do we bring it back together as a whole so that we're not missing bits? And the key part of permaculture design is to eliminate waste in the system. It's like, how does nature work, and how do we reflect how nature works in how we live? Because we are nature. It just makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you both. I would invite both of you just to spend a few minutes on the Q&A section, because there are some interesting questions. We may not have time to get to all of those questions today, but whichever questions resonates with you, if you would like to type an answer, please go ahead and do that in the next few minutes. But with this, I would like to, bring this panel to a close. I think, the sense I got in this whole conversation is it's so many layers that we need to take care of. As we look at circularity, it's consumption versus, regeneration to, what do we do with companies? How do we transform mindsets? And how do we take care of the internet of the underground? So many things which has kind of informed us. We are actually leaving this panel with a lot of good insights into the next few panels and discussions what we're going to have. And probably by next week, when we come to the actionable stuff, we're going to have group discussions on some of the topics that you brought out. So we're going to meet, we're going to do a hybrid event in Mumbai next week. So we'll keep you posted how it goes. And but I guess this is just the beginning of what we can attempt to do, peeling the various layers of circularity and trying to zero in on what is that we can truly attempt to do. That's kind of where we are going with this knowledge that we have got from this panel. I really, really want to thank both of you and also Samir, who left us early, but Morag, especially to you to have stayed up late and inspiring us. And Pratna, the conversation, there are many questions about why can't companies do this? Why can't we do this? And so, please try to address some of those questions. But thank you so much, and really wishing you, Pratna, the best of luck in navigating the corporate world, coming from the academic world as well. So we're all with you, and please reach out to us. And thank you once again, both of you, and have a wonderful rest of the evening.
And thank you, Vishnu, for hosting so beautifully.
Thank you. Thank you. And Shilpa, over to you.
Thank you, Vishnu. It has indeed been a very insightful, and there's been so much to learn from this discussion. I mean, even from Wilma's keynote. I'm going to just quickly summarize with some key highlights from this discussion. What came forward is that net zero is, it is now a freely used term, but using that term is not enough. We need to refocus on reduction in consumption. Our GDP needs to be restructured to focus and include repair, refill, lend, borrow, swap, recycle. We are looking at industry to move us from a linear system to a circular system. ESG needs to have a clear intent to move to action. Circular economy has been a part of our lives for a long time. Resource efficiency and managing consumption lived with us, and we began there, and we still live there in our villages. Strengthening the linkage between consumers and producers is extremely important. We are behind on applying circular practices, and therefore there needs to be global consensus or regulation on how we look at the end of life of products and figuring what would be the best way of dealing with them. If we educate and provide an enabling environment, mindsets can change. And we need to celebrate the wins and show how circularity can be looked at being cost effective, which could make it more actionable. So with that, we end this panel. To each of our panelists, thank you so much for contributing and for sharing your knowledge and for being present today. As an acknowledgement of your participation, we have donated 5 saplings for each of you through Reforest India. You will be receiving communication soon from Reforest India regarding the same. Our next panel will begin at 6 p.m. And we hope to see everybody back here to continue learning and being a part of the discussion. Thank you so much.